Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. My name is Alan Feldstein, member 1094 of the world-famous Adventurers Club of Los Angeles, and I'm very honored to be here with our speaker tonight. It's not Adam West, it's not Michael Keaton, it's not Ben Affleck, it's the real Batman that is with us tonight, and I'm very, very grateful to have you here with us, Merle. I don't even know where to begin. I was reading your biography, and you have led not only an incredible life, but an adventurous life, and it's so great to have you here at the Adventurers Club of Los Angeles, and thank you for coming out and welcome. It's really much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Alan. I feel especially privileged to be interviewed by you. I've looked at a number of interviews with you, and I'm aware that you're one of the few people who is a true adventurer, who always tries to leave every place he goes a little bit better, both for the humans and the wildlife.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
To be here with you.
I appreciate that very much. So I guess the easiest thing to do is let's start at the beginning. We have a photo here. I'm assuming you're the one in the middle. And tell us a little bit about your history and background.
I put in a few photos at the beginning just to illustrate how I got started. I owe a lot to my parents who loved nature. My father was an avid shell collector. His collection is still housed at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. By the time I was 3 years old there, I knew most of the scientific names of the shells of the Hawaiian archipelago. And so I got a very early start in both nature and adventure. It wasn't long until actually by the time I was 5, I started catching big snakes and hauling them into the house to show my parents. My mother was
Your mom must have loved that.
Snakes, but she didn't want to put that on me, so she would pretend not to be afraid and let me put them somewhere in a cage supposedly safe till my father came home. And unfortunately, I wasn't very good at keeping snakes caged at that time. And for example, one evening, my mother had turned out all the house lights and was walking down the hall to go to bed, and she stepped on a 5-foot snake of mine, which wrapped around her ankle.
But tell me the story you told me earlier, Merlin, about your mom was not really well loved by your neighbors because she had a bunch of neighbors over one day.
When we first moved to Tampa, Florida, a bunch of neighbor ladies came over to welcome my mother to the neighborhood. And I had several days before caught a coach whip snake that was 7 feet 8 inches long. That was my pride and joy, that big snake I'd caught. But it had gotten loose and we couldn't find it, and we thought it had gotten out of the house, and so we'd just basically forgotten about it, had gotten away. But when this group came to visit my mother and welcome her to the neighborhood, they're all sitting around in a semicircle in our living room, and all of a sudden this snake rears up looking all of the world like a cobra from behind the couch behind my mother's head and starts scanning the room. Those women practically broke the door off its hinges getting out the front door, and about half of them never would speak to my mother again.
But we've talked about shells and snakes, but your claim to fame is bats. And what got you into bats in the first place?
Well, let me, before we get to the bats, point out that one of the reasons that I take so many great pictures of bats is that I learned falconry by the time I was 14. And here I am with my Harris's hawk. I used to go hunting with her every day after school. My parents never had to worry about what I was up to. I was out with my hawk. And later I used that training from falconry to train bats, and we'll talk about that later. By the time I was 17, I started to get interested in bats, and this picture was taken on my first day when I made a big discovery. I had found some bats in a cave near my home and looked them up in a field guide, and it said that they never migrated. This species lived in the same cave year-round. Well, I got curious and started watching them, and I figured out that they were only present in the spring and fall, which led me to believe that they must be migrating. So, as a high school student, 17 years old, I convinced my mom to drive me to the Smithsonian so that I could tell the scientists who wrote the books that there was something wrong. The bats hadn't read their books. And so they gave me some bat bands. I banded a couple hundred of the bats, and only a couple months later, I found several of my banded bats. It was the biggest accident. I can't even believe the odds against it. More than 100 miles from where I banded them, north, when we thought they would probably migrate south for the winter. And so it was a huge, exciting discovery. And then I wanted to look, see if there were more in the cave. My parents were very, as I said, adventuresome, interested in nature. So they were with me that day, and they went just so far, and we got to a little narrow passage that neither one of them wanted to get into. So I went down, and it got narrower and narrower until I could barely breathe, and I thought I was going to be trapped and never get out alive because I couldn't back up in such a tight passage. But I finally squeezed and went forward and got out of it, came to an entrance room, last place my parents would have thought that I would be, noticed bats disappearing in it looked like a solid wall 30 feet overhead or so, and you couldn't see any opening there, but the bats were disappearing, so I assumed there was, and I found a way to climb up there, found a canyon passage, went back, climbed in the end 70 feet from above the floor, and on, and it's a story way too long to tell you tonight, but I finally got back to an inner room where in those days bats were very persecuted, and they went to these extremely remote parts of caves sometimes to try to escape humans. Well, I finally found 250,000 bats back there, and that was an incredible discovery for a 17-year-old kid. And a lot of them were banded. I got carried away reading the band numbers, and I was using a carbide light, and in my naivety and excitement, I forgot that I didn't have any extra water or carbide for my light. I ran out, and I've never been more frightened in my life than finding a way to climb in almost total darkness back over 70 feet above the floor. And I finally heard my father calling in the distance, and even then couldn't get out because we got to a place where he could just hand carbide and water through a hole, but we couldn't reach each other. But
that'll teach you to be prepared next time.
Right. Well, from there, I went on to become a collector of small mammals. In those days, if you wanted to be a mammologist, you had to collect specimens. It was in the early days when taxonomy was a big issue. And I got quite good at collecting, and so by the time I was a senior in high school, the Smithsonian was paying for all my field work.
That's a good deal.
And so then when I got out of college at 24, and let me tell you, don't worry if you have a child who is borderline flunking out of school all the time, as long as that kid has something he or she is passionate about that they are paying attention to, let them go. I flunked out of school twice. I almost didn't graduate from college, which would have been a big embarrassment because the Smithsonian had already offered me a job co-directing a $400,000 project in Venezuela. But I finally, by the skin of my teeth, graduated from college, and later went on to get my PhD with honors. All it took was to finally get to do what I wanted to do, what I was passionate about. And I've been passionate about bats ever since. And I've had an incredibly fun life. And I don't think there's anything you can do better than to combine the thrill of adventure with the knowledge that you have made a huge difference in helping people and the wildlife that support us.
Well, that's well said. And you and I, when we were talking earlier, talked about this. And, you know, one of my passions is cheetahs. And you said something to me very fascinating when we were talking. And that was that you said bats are similar to cheetahs. And I would like you to tell the crowd, because that does not sound possible, but it is. And what made you tell me that?
Well, they're only really similar in the fact that they are very intelligent and trainable. The first cheetahs I ever came in contact with were in John Hamlet's collection of birds of prey, actually, in Florida. And he had his cheetahs trained, and I was so impressed with them. And later I thought back to his trained cheetahs when I was training bats. But we'll get to training bats a little later. I see you've got a picture here of my first expedition plane. I can tell you that was quite a heady deal at 24, being assigned a C-47 to carry your expedition to a remote savanna without even a runway. The pilot and crew that flew that plane begged us to get back on. We unloaded 2 tons of equipment. We weren't going to see another plane or anybody else for months. And they thought for sure it was suicidal. There were biting gnats biting us. It was sweltering hot. They begged us to get back on the plane, and they would find an alibi to cover us for giving up. That nobody should be left out there.
But like we've talked about, you followed your passion and you stayed out there. And, you know, one of the things that Phoebe said in your introduction is, you know, you have over 150,000 photos of bats, and your photos are basically the essence of documenting bats here. And I want to show people some of the amazing photos that you have taken, and maybe you can talk about each of these photos, because I think people have a grave misconception of bats. And I think by showing these photos, you really show the beauty of this mammal, and then we'll talk about how important they are in the environment.
One of the big misconceptions about bats is that they're all dirty, ugly creatures, and that's because most people never see a bat close up unless it's sick and dying, and most of us don't look too good on our deathbed either. This first one is a painted bat from Southeast Asia. The first photo I saw of one of those bats was so brilliantly colored that I accused the photographer of playing with Photoshop. I didn't think that any mammal could actually be that brilliantly colored. And the next one here is the yellow-winged bat from equatorial Africa. Alan, you may have seen these. When you're out on safaris, right near Nairobi, actually, you'll occasionally get too close to a bush and make one of these uncomfortable. They live in pairs, and they apparently mate for life. And when you scare them up, you can't miss them because those brilliant yellow wings flash in the sunlight. But this is a cool bat that the male goes out and finds a place to that's where there's a lot of extra food to catch insects, and the female doesn't leave until he comes back and leads her to the best place to feed that night. And throughout the Old World tropics, there are literally hundreds of species of flying fox bats that are just as cute as any puppy or kitten you ever had at home. Amazing animals. We also have bats that are as strange as any dinosaur. And to those of us who understand bats, we especially like the dinosaur bats because they're probably the most sophisticated in terms of their navigation systems. It's been estimated that they have, that even average bats have sonar that is more than 1 billion times more efficient than anything we've ever developed.
And what's this one here? Does the tongue permanently stay out, or does it? Or was it just just sticking his tongue out at you?
This is my jolly good fellow. If he were courting, he would be hanging upside down with his cheeks inflated to enhance the resonance of his call, just like a frog, male frog calling to attract a female. But he's not attracting a female here. I've given him a fig and he's crammed it into his pouches to keep anybody else from taking it away from him.
I want to name him Dizzy Gillespie is what I want is what I want to name him.
Now this one is, I think, one of the most spectacular mammals in the entire world, and it's found right here in this area. Probably not in the city, but if you go outside the city, they're found all the way up into northern California and down into Mexico. It's a spotted bat. Has ears as long as its head and body combined. Both ears and wings are pink translucent. It's an incredible animal, and it has audible echolocation. It's a stealth bat. Most bats have echolocation that sweeps across several frequencies, often crossing 40 kilohertz. So insects that want to evade bats try to set their hearing for about 40 kilohertz so that they can hear a bat coming and drop to the ground or do something to evade the bat. This bat is a very clever fellow. He has echolocation that is so low we can hear it, but the insects who've tuned their ears for 40 kilohertz to listen for bats can't hear him coming. The bat can fly right up and grab the moth without the moth knowing that there's anybody in pursuit.
That is a beautiful mammal and a beautiful photograph.
And there's also a group of bats in the old world that do just the opposite and have echolocation that's above 150 kilohertz so that insects can't hear them either. And bats have a huge impact on insects, and of course that's why insects had to develop the ability to hear bats. If we can go on to the next picture here. After this, I could spend days telling you about experiences in the Smithsonian on that expedition. Before I go ahead and tell you about coming back, I'm going to, if we can back up a couple pictures, there we go. The first place we went on the Smithsonian expedition was the Cunnacanuma River, and at that time it was more than 20 feet above flood stage. So using a powerful outboard motor on the end of the dugout, we had dugouts that were 50 and 55 feet long. You can imagine trying to motor dugouts up a raging whitewater river. Well, we got up to our base camp quite a few miles up the river, but nobody told us that within a month the river would go down, and when it went down it would be very, very different. We can see, fancy taking a 50-foot canoe dugout down through this kind of rapids.
I've shot rapids, but I don't think I'd want to do it in a 50-foot dugout canoe, that's for sure. Especially as the water goes down, there's more hazards that appear. So as you can see in this photo, you've got rocks and other things that you've got to deal with, which is really incredible.
Well, if you go to the next picture, you'll see two of my guys that worked for me.
And tell us about what they did for you and the project that you worked on there.
Well, these guys were great hunters, and I was hired to collect everything from jaguars to shrews for the Smithsonian. And these guys, if I went out and set 100 rat traps for rats, I would be lucky if I caught 3 rats in a night. If I gave 2 traps to each Indian, they would come back with 3 or 4 rats each. And so these guys would trap and hunt for me. The one thing I can still remember in Yanomama was Torobo. Whenever there was a new rat caught in a trap, they'd come running in, Torobo, Torobo. But here, they've told me they're going to have to be gone for a few days because they're going on a raid to kill enemy warriors from another village. And they're painting curare on special arrow tips that are designed specifically to kill humans. And in fact, seeing that you have almost everything imaginable from expeditions around the world, I thought I'd surprise Alan, and I brought him tonight a steel curare tipped arrow that is notched and prepared to kill a human.
So
Watch
behave
out.
yourselves out there.
Don't make him mad. Now, if we want to go back to after 2 years in the jungle, I decided to return and go to graduate school to get a PhD. And of course, I wanted to go back and study the gray bats that I'd first discovered as a high school student. And I ended up banding 42,000 of them and tracing them all over the southeast. If we can have the next picture. The trouble was, when I went back to do my thesis on them, people were pouring kerosene into caves, lighting it on fire, and killing sometimes tens of thousands of them in single incidents. And the floors would be covered with skeletons like this. Why? Newspaper headlines like this, claiming that bats were mostly rabid, would attack people. The health department in those days would actually go out in Tennessee, they'd go out and warn families that had a cave on their property that the bats were rabid and dangerous. To my knowledge, no one has ever contracted any disease from a gray bat to this day. There was no grounds for this scaring people other than that it was lucrative and getting budgets to do research that wasn't needed.
And I think, you raise a really good point, and I think one of the things that is important for our audience to know is you've been involved in a couple of really incredible projects, both in Kenya and in Thailand, and showing people how important bats are to the environment, that they're not a danger, and how they can really help humanity in mitigating diseases and saving crops and that sort of thing.
That's true. Before I get to those, let me finish a little bit more
Sure.
about the gray bat. If we can go to the next slide. I found about every kind of obstacle you can imagine when I started truly devoting full time to studying gray bats for my thesis. In this picture, I'm with the most feared moonshiner of that part of Tennessee. You didn't work in that area in those days without being on friendly terms with certain moonshiners. They came down almost immediately when they found me going into one of my most important bat caves, came down to check me out, and I welcomed them and invited them to bring their wives and come down that night, and I'd be banding bats, and I'd show them how my trap worked and everything, and we ended up being buddies. And in fact, when winter came and they saw me camping out in the snow, they offered to let me come and stay at this moonshiner offered to let me stay in his home. It's such a ramshackle shack that you couldn't all of you get in the same room at once without risk of it caving in. But
how was the moonshine, though?
The moonshine was really stiff stuff. I've still got some at home, but I don't drink it. But these guys were truly incredible. I quit staying with him when I found out that he slept with a sawed-off shotgun under his bed in case the revenue was attacked in the middle of the night. I didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. But not only did I have to deal with moonshiners, and some moonshiners weren't nearly that friendly. I've been shot at and I've had guns waved in my face that far away. But other problems studying the gray bats, if you want to go to the next slide. This is a place in one of my study caves where I had to crawl through to get to the bats that were trying to escape being killed by people. And if you look at that rock that's on its edge, it's only about that thick, and it's holding up a rock that weighs more than a ton. And it's already started to split the rock. I used to be very, very careful when I'd go by that and never to touch it for fear I'd be killed. After 10 years of going by it without touching it, I came back and it had finally fallen and would have killed me had I been there when it happened. Go to the next slide. This is another one of my primary study caves. To get in, you had to rope 50 feet down to the cave entrance. Then you had to rope 105 feet free fall.
Wow.
To get in. You crawled 40 feet, and then you roped another 75 feet.
Where is this cave located?
This one is in northern Alabama. You want to go to the next? Here I'm 70 feet above the floor, braced between two walls. To find the banded bats, I had to brace between walls and climb up and down. And one of the problems was sometimes I'd get really excited about finding new banded bats. It's really exciting when you find a bat that you haven't seen in 15 years and you remember you banded him back when you were in high school, and it's like meeting an old friend. But I'd get excited sometimes and climb too high for too long, and after a while your legs get really tired holding you between two walls like that. And everybody that's ever done any climbing knows that it's a whole lot easier to climb up than to climb down.
Amen.
So there are a few times when I really came near not making it back down, or at least making it back down much quicker than I wanted to.
What is the lifespan of a bat?
Excuse me?
What is the lifespan of a bat?
I calculated based on my banded ones that the oldest ones were living over 40 years. And I didn't believe it at that time. I thought there was something wrong with my statistics. And then later, many years later, there was a study in Europe where they absolutely proved that bats of the same genus were living over 40 years. So then I had to accept my own data as probably correct. Now this picture shows something that I'm very proud of. This was one of my main study caves, and as I said, cave owners were burning their bats, cavers were killing bats as well, and the American Society for the Advancement of Science at one point in about 1970 decided that bats were in such serious bad decline that they needed special help, and they mounted a special effort to save the bats. But about that time came along the people basically lying about rabies, certainly exaggerating. And so the whole effort to save bats ground to a halt, and people started burning them. Cavers would take pride in tearing out protective gates as fast as conservationists could put them in caves. So again, you know, I learned to make friends with the moonshiners to survive, and again I learned to make friends with the cavers in order for my research to survive. And in the end, by making friends, I found that if I made enough friends for the bats, I didn't need to win battles. And so I'm very proud to point out that today we have millions more gray bats than when their extinction was predicted. In fact, you go to the next, skip one more forward, please. This is one of the caves today where you see the huge numbers of hibernating bats. And go to the next one, please. Can somebody move the slides?
There may be a technical glitch there. But while we're waiting for that next slide.
We got a video on it.
Okay.
Kayakers with bats that
Yeah, but it's not showing down here.
No, the videos won't show here.
Okay, so you see the kayakers?
Yeah.
In both Alabama, well, actually in Alabama, Missouri, and Tennessee, there are places now where there's substantial income to communities from tourism coming to watch gray bats emerge out of their caves and fly across the rivers. If you go out there in a kayak, these bats feed very low over the water, so you sit there and they're going right by within a couple feet of you, and it gives people quite a thrill.
Well, I told you the story that happened to me when I was in Malawi. I was reading with a headlamp because I didn't want to disturb the person sleeping next to me. And there was a bat in our room, and he loved it. And we had a great relationship because I'd turn on my headlamp, read my book, and all the bugs would be attracted to the light, and the bat would swoop down and eat all the insects for me and kept them from bothering me. And I was helping him get fed, and we became great friends over that.
You're the exception to the rule. Most people I have investigated, I don't know how many cases where a poor bat tries to catch a mosquito flying around somebody's head. The person sees the bat coming at high speed toward him, decides that he must be about to be attacked, runs for the house, dives through the door, and says, "Oh my God, how lucky could I get? I barely escaped that attacking bat," never even knowing that the bat never even followed him. The bat caught the mosquito and went on to do something else.
Right.
And in fact, in one case, a person got scratched on a rose bush on the way in.
Serves them right.
And ended up going down and getting rabies vaccine. Somebody suspected that he hadn't been actually attacked and had me look, and I immediately pieced together that he had run by a rose bush, and he was very reluctant to stop taking the shots because he was afraid that because I worked for the county, I was lying to cover for the county. That he said, you know, he knew bats when he saw them, and he saw a bat after him. So now this picture starts a whole nother interesting story. After I got my PhD, I got a really great full-time research job at the Milwaukee Public Museum in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I was invited to go to the British Museum to speak about my gray bat research. And while there, a colleague invited me to go to a cave where I could photograph a rare bat, a rare and endangered species, a lesser horseshoe bat. And so neither I nor the guy who invited me knew what we were getting into. There was a caver that had simply said that he knew where there was a cave that had this rare bat in it. Well, we got there, and it was one thing that it was a firing range where the Germans were coming over and testing missiles, and the missiles were going over our heads. But the worst of it was that this cave was halfway down on a nearly 200-foot high cliff. And here I am just going over the lip. The limestone there was almost razor sharp. And I didn't even have gloves with me because I hadn't intended to do anything like that. So I don't think I've ever been more nervous than when I went down like nearly 100 feet below the lip and had to swing back and forth to get in and grab something to get into the cave. And all I've got is visions of what must be cutting my rope up at the top if it got off the padding. But in the cave, we did find what we were looking for, one endangered bat in that whole cave. But can we see the bat? This is a hibernating lesser horseshoe bat, and it's just one of many stories I could tell you about. My first night in Africa, for example, I was netting bats over a river with crocodiles in it, and I was trying to watch for crocodile eyes when a pride of lions showed up. And I'll tell you those stories maybe later if we have time, but
Yeah, because I do want to talk about your conservation efforts.
yeah, let's
that
see
do
what we
that.
got next year. Speaking of conservation efforts, these bats live in Bracken Cave, 20 miles from the center of San Antonio, Texas. There are up to 20 million bats in this cave, and studying them puts forward a whole new set of problems. With so many bats breathing in a cave, the CO2 gathers in the lower parts of the cave, and you can actually faint and die without knowing what's wrong if no one's told you about CO2 and the symptoms. And in fact, when I first went into these caves in Texas to study the bats, I wore a respirator to protect me from ammonia fumes that come from dermestid larvae eating the bat guano. And I thought I was safe, but I ended up in the hospital for 10 days. I was so bad that the last day I went in, I started to go down to my blind where I was trying to photograph vultures coming into the cave to catch bats. And I realized at one point that if I went a step further, I probably would never come out again.
Wow.
And I had to be driven to the hospital. I couldn't even drive my own car. But I spent then the next more than 20 years protecting this site. And we today not only own the cave is protected, but 2,000 acres around it are protected, just 20 miles from the center of San Antonio. If there was ever an impossible challenge, that was it. How do you acquire that kind of land in a city? So why would you go to all that work? Well, let me point out that this one colony of bats can catch 100 tons of insects in a single night. This one bat here is eating a corn earworm moth in flight. That moth probably is containing about 1,000 eggs. It's just migrating into Texas from Mexico. The Department of Parks and Wildlife in Texas conservatively estimates that bats in Texas are saving agriculture more than $1.4 billion annually. And if you have any doubts about how important that is, let me point out that just recently, the journal Science, which I think many of you know is a very reputable journal, published a paper where they looked to see what was happening where bats were being destroyed. And where bat populations in the U.S. had declined the most, they found a 31% increase in pesticide use for agriculture. And they also found that that increase in pesticides was killing more than 1,000 infant humans annually. You don't have to take that from me. Just go to the library and find the Journal of Science and you can read it for yourself. But bats are hugely important in keeping insects in balance worldwide. In fact, almost anything you want to think about that you like, for example, if you like chocolate, a study in Indonesia showed that bats that eat insects are saving cacao farmers, that's the source for chocolate, an estimated $800 million annually. You may be wondering how I get pictures like this showing. Now, the first bat you saw had long, narrow wings, and that was what we call a jet bat. They can fly up to 100 miles an hour, aided by a tailwind. But these with the short, broad wings are able to fly like helicopters. And the way I get good pictures of them catching prey, like you just saw, is I train them to come to my hand on call, and then I train them to go where I point. And I met a famous anthropologist, behaviorist, a number of years ago in Madagascar, and her first question was, "Do you really train bats?" And I said, "Yes, I did." "Well, what do you train them to do?" And I said, "Well, I can train them to go where I point when I want them to go catch prey in a place where I can get the picture." And she was flabbergasted. She said, "Have you ever published that? We can't even train primates to go where we point."
Let alone humans.
The only animal that they have been able to train, at least at that time, she said, was a dog. Dogs had been in association with people long enough that apparently they had evolved, there had been natural selection for understanding human body language better than other animals. But just recently, I was with Skip here filming bats in Costa Rica, and he can vouch that our first 3 bats we caught that we wanted to show pollinating flowers, I trained them to come on call to my hand in 5 to 10 minutes.
Now, do you whistle to get a bat to come to you, or how do you?
What I'm doing is when I do that, I'm making a full range of sound from low to high frequency, so wherever the bat's ears are tuned, he can hear the sound I'm making.
That's incredible.
Here's Skip and Joy filming, and we skipped way ahead. I'd like to go back.
Well, I would like, if you don't mind, I'd like to go to Thailand.
Yeah.
I'd like to go to
That's
Thailand right now, but let's.
We'll get there in a minute. Here.
Okay.
Please advance the picture. Somebody monitoring
We got a video going.
Is anybody?
No, we got the video showing.
Oh, okay. Bats aren't just, 70% of bats eat insects, and that's really important. But they also do a lot of other important things. This video is showing long-nosed bats pollinating the agave from which all tequila and mezcal are produced, billions of dollars worth that we wouldn't have without bat pollinators. And they also pollinate a large proportion of the world's most valuable plants. For example, let's go on to the baobab. The baobab is so important to other wildlife that it's often been referred to as the African tree of life. And when I first went to Africa, everybody thought that bush babies were the pollinators, but they're not. It's pollinated by bats. A bush baby has to climb down from up above and drinks the nectar from between the petals, but he never ever gets down to the reproductive organs that are hanging beneath the flower. Only when a bat comes does he encase the flower in his wings and against his body and carry pollen. Now I've got, I want to show you the importance of bats in seed dispersal. These little fruit bats can eat twice their body weight in fruit in a single night. And it's a big misconception that they're a scourge to fruit growers. That's not true. In fact, I learned that in Kenya. The biggest mango grower in Kenya, when I asked him to do if I had permission to do research on whether bats damaged his crop or not, he laughed at me and said, "You said you're an expert on bats, you don't know that they actually help me?" But he was the only one I found in Kenya that knew. What was happening was bush babies and monkeys were coming and biting into green mangoes and causing damage that they couldn't be marketed. The bats were coming and eating lots of mangoes, but they were only eating the mangoes that ripened prematurely and couldn't be harvested or were missed by the harvesters. Bats have the same taste in mangoes that we do, and they won't eat one until it's ripe, and if it's already ripe on the tree, it's no good for the harvest. So now let's go to the next picture, which is a video. I haven't taken video, and I thought I was.
Yeah.
Damn it. Can we see the video?
Yeah, the video's going.
These are straw-colored flying foxes. They have a nearly 3 foot wingspan, and these migrate. This video was taken in Zambia, and these bats are absolutely critical to a whole lot of things, not only in Africa, but probably here in the United States as well, because in their seasonal migrations across Africa, they actually disperse thousands and thousands of tons of seeds. They're absolutely essential to forest regrowth, and you've probably heard that one of the causes of global climate change is loss of forests.
Yep.
And yet, right at a time when we're thinking about all the most expensive ideas to stop global climate change, we're practically ignoring the fact that some of the best seed dispersers in the world are practically on the brink of extinction because of neglect when they should be protected as our best reforesters. Now, I can tell you a story or two here, or we can skip ahead to
Let's skip ahead to Thailand, because I want to make sure because I know people are going to have questions for us.
Okay.
And I think what you accomplished in Thailand, and here's a picture of you educating, and we talked about this, you weren't teaching scientists, you were teaching the local community about the importance of bats to their industry.
This is in Thailand. Wherever I go, I make certain to teach the local people about bats and why they're important. One of my big complaints with modern science is that scientists are rewarded strictly as a publish or perish. You know, the more publications, the better, whether they do anything for the environment or people. It seems too often to be ignored. And most scientists will go to a place like this and do research, go home and never say anything to the local people about what they discovered. But I, as a rule, pretty much subscribe to Alan's idea that you ought to leave a place better than you found it. So here's a good example of me gathered 2 or 3 generations of a Thai family, explaining to them about why their bats are important.
We're not seeing that. Next slide. Okay, next slide.
You're not seeing?
No, we have the video on.
Oh, okay. Did you see the Thai family now?
No.
Let's go back one slide. Here we go.
I can't see it. So.
Here we go.
No, it's just the Kasanka video. Yeah, we're still looking at the...
Can we skip it? Can we skip the video? There we go. Okay.
Skip another slide forward and we'll get to... Now we're going to hit another video, though. I was of the impression that you could play videos, so I didn't know any better. And also, I have lectured to national and international conventions on every continent, and I use my pictures as key door openers. If you go, like, I've lectured even to an international conference of rabies specialists, and I started my lecture with, I'm aware that you've all heard about bats being especially dangerous as sources of rabies. How many of you have a dog at home? Most of them. Are you aware that in the United States and Canada combined, bats kill only 1 to 2 people a year of any cause, and dogs in the U.S. alone kill 45 people a year? Now, let me put this in perspective. Before you go on a rampage to rid our neighborhoods of dangerous dogs, let's consider how hypocritical that would be in a society where our spouses kill us off at about 2,000 a year. So we got to put these things in perspective, and that's what I often do. It's helpful to start out with pictures like I've already showed you. Bats are just so incredible, people can't believe there is such a thing. And then you soften them up to admit to themselves that there's a whole lot they have yet to learn about bats.
But what did you teach the Thai family?
Now I'm about to get to your Thai story. I can't see what's up, so are we on the video?
Let's go one more.
We got the video of the Thai bats? Okay, 43 years ago, I was in Thailand photographing bats, and I took just 15 minutes to talk to the monks that own Khao Chong Pron Cave. I saw evidence that there had been a much, much larger population of bats in the cave previously, but they weren't protecting it, and local hunters would go up and kill thousands and thousands at a time and sell them to restaurants for people to eat. And so I explained to the monks that owned the cave that if they would just protect the bats and let them repopulate, that it could be very economically lucrative for them. Time and time again, I've saved bats by showing people the benefits to them. And in this case, when I came back 10 years later, they were already making $98,000 a year selling bat guano. And today they're making $200,000 a year selling bat guano fertilizer. And not only that, but there's been a study done showing that the bats are saving rice growers, rice farmers, $300,000 a year. And they're also attracting thousands of tourists, and there's so much money coming in now that that one village is probably earning close to $1 million a year in U.S. currency from having saved and restored the bats. And they're so appreciative that at the school, the principal, the teachers, and the students all wear bat t-shirts to school one day each week, honoring the bats and what they do for them, because now for the first time the students can get scholarships to go to college paid for by bat money.
And I think that really shows, you know, if we teach less about trying to rid problems and learn how to live together in nature holistically,
Right.
it's a much better way to go.
Did we get to see the emergence of all the bats coming out of the cave?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I want to jump to Austin, because that's my first experience with bats, as I told you. When I used to go travel down to Austin, doing battle with the Department of Health down there. I stayed near a place that was near the cave, and let's talk about the Austin Project and what you were able to accomplish
Let's go
there.
back one slide. Okay. In the early 1980s, suddenly Austin started making national, near national news, with newspapers from coast to coast saying that hundreds of thousands of rabid bats were invading and attacking the citizens of Austin. I was still in Milwaukee, but I just announced that I was resigning my almost perfect tenured position, full-time research, and I was not only resigning that position, but I was doing it so that I could devote full-time to conserving bats at a time when almost everybody would have rather paid to kill a bat than to save a bat. And so when I heard about that these hundreds of thousands of rabid bats were attacking the people of Austin, I had to go down and see this right away. Well, I took a look and concluded that the truth was that this was a gold mine of an opportunity, and I so believed it that I sold my home, packed up, and moved to Austin to center my bat conservation efforts in the city where people feared bats more than any place else in the world. And now if you move to the next slide, as you can see, very soon after I showed people that they didn't have anything to fear from the bats became incredibly popular. Austin is now world famous for its bats. Bats are by far its most famous citizens. And since the bats came and I convinced the city not to kill them, they have, by conservative estimate, attracted more than 200 million tourist dollars to Austin. That's right, 200 million. And now we're just starting to work on establishing an education center in Austin where people from all over the world can learn the value of protecting bats. These columns of bats, sometimes you can see up to 5 columns for a mile down the river. And they're an incredible attraction, one of the finest wildlife attractions you can find anywhere in America. And they wouldn't be there today had it not been for just one person knowing that bats weren't dangerous. Those bats have never attacked anyone in the decades that they've been protected now. They just go out and consume literally tons of insect pests every night and attract tourism.
In fact, you've actually had a day named after you, which is much deserved, and I think this is the perfect place to end our discussion and open it up to people who I'm sure have a ton of questions for you.
Well, I just want to end by saying I didn't harangue you with a whole lot of information about how desperate bats are, but the truth is that right here in the United States, bats are now officially the most endangered mammals.
Wow.
And they're in serious trouble worldwide, especially since all this propaganda about where COVID-19 and Ebola and things like that came from. They didn't come from bats. And in fact, the person who in the organization who were foremost in promoting this fear that Ebola and COVID-19 came from bats was recently fired for promoting misinformation as a scientist. So bats do need a lot of help, and I'm very hopeful that many of you will want to join my organization in helping save bats. We've got a lot of work cut out to do before we overcome all the damage that was done in the last decade telling people that Ebola and COVID came from bats.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to start the question off. I have a question. My question is, how do you band a bat?
I was uniquely successful in banding lots of bats because I had a very, one thing I've forgotten, I should point out that I'm the luckiest guy in the world to have inherited the parents I inherited. My dad was incredibly creative and adventuresome and loved helping me with my research. And the audience here tonight, you can see there are an awful lot of people around the world who have helped fund my work and enabled me to do what I do. But now
So how do you band a bat?
yeah,
though?
how do you band the bat? My father developed a special way that he's the only one I know of even today that has ever used this technique. But the bands would come closed, strung in numeric order on wires. And in the old days, when you banded a bird or a bat, you had to use a special type of pliers to pry the band open and then squeeze it shut on the wing. My father found an old cylinder from an engine, drilled a hole in it that was just the right size, diameter, and then he tapered a long piece of steel with a handle on the end, and you could feed these bands in numeric order onto that and then shove it through the hole in the cylinder, and it would open 50 or so bands at a time to exactly the right width. So when I banded bats, I didn't end up killing a lot of them because the old bands, when they just squeeze them shut with your fingers, you didn't know whether you'd squeeze them too tight or too loose or what. And so it did a lot of damage, and eventually the Fish and Wildlife Service quit giving out bands for that reason. But I had practically no trouble because I had a father who was really creative and figured out how to open large numbers of bands in a safe manner for the bats. And I ended up banding more than 42,000 bats.
Do they just hang there and you can just walk up and band them, or do you? I mean, I would think they would.
No,
be...
we had to catch them, and that brings up another point. I invented the trap that's now used worldwide to catch bats. In fact, I rue the day that I invented that trap when these virologists got a hold of those traps and used them to catch bats to kill for their efforts to prove that bats were dangerous. I hated seeing something that I invented used by these guys for such bad purposes.
Well, thank you very much. Fascinating talk. I heard that on the continent of Africa, that if you wonder what animal weighs more than any other animal, you'd think it'd be the lion, the elephant or the hippo, but it's the bat. There's more bats. The population of bats in Africa is so great that the total bat population weighs way more than the total elephant population. Have you heard that too?
I haven't personally heard that, but I have heard things that would tend to corroborate what you're saying. Charlie Handley, who headed the Division of Mammals at the Smithsonian, hired me many years ago to lead the project in Venezuela, concluded that there were more biomass weight of bats in a Latin American rainforest than the weight of all other mammals combined. The monkeys, the tapirs, the deer, the wild peccaries, the jaguars, the sheer mass of bats outweighed all other mammals combined. World history, bats are the only living mammals that I'm aware of that shared our planet with dinosaurs. They go way back, and before modern humans came to America, they filled our skies in numbers that by night rivaled passenger pigeons by day. There were huge numbers, and we can see the evidence in caves where they've stained walls from roosting on them for long periods of time. So even before white nose syndrome hit, we had lost more bats prior to that than we've lost since from what we're paying attention to now. But what I want to point out is that bats are, you can't just save a few endangered species and solve our problems. Our planet is evolved to depend on large numbers of bats. We should be treating places like Bracken Cave like they were endangered species instead of saying, oh, that bat's still common, we don't need to, you know, I don't know how many times people have asked me, I want them to save a colony of bats, and they say, are they endangered? You can't wait until bats are considered endangered and then decide to protect them because you're losing all the services.
Could you address just for a moment the social structure of bats? In other words, does it work like a beehive? How are these millions of bats organized? How do they organize themselves?
There was a study done just a few years ago, published in the Royal Proceedings, I think it is, in UK. At any rate, in that study, they actually put chips, I forgot what you call them, they insert under the skin and you can follow the animal. You put these in dogs now and cats.
Yeah, microchips.
Yeah, and using these in bats, they were able to follow several generations of bats and know who knew who and who traveled where with who and everything. And they concluded from that study that bats have social organization strikingly similar to that of higher primates.
So I was wondering if you could elucidate the current situation on white nose syndrome. But how's it going, and has it completely spread all throughout the US at this point and into Canada and Mexico?
White nose syndrome has probably spread just about everywhere that it can go now. But the fungus that causes it doesn't kill bats in Europe, and it's widespread in Europe. And I have a paper right now submitted for publication that's been rejected 3 times because the reviewers don't want to admit that we don't need a cure for white nose syndrome, because they're getting grants of up to $8 million in a single grant to look for a cure for white nose syndrome. What's happened to our bats that didn't happen in Europe, and I have a paper submitted for publication right now on this, what's happened is in most of Europe, the caves where bats hibernate average 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, a perfect temperature for conserving energy through a long winter. And the fungus that causes white nose syndrome doesn't grow very fast at such low temperatures. So the bats save energy and the fungus grows slower, so it can't get bad enough to make them wake up and lose energy before they come out in the spring. So that's my opinion as to why they're not dying of this fungus in Europe. In the United States, we have a very different situation. We have not seen any mass die-offs in the West. In the West, bats hibernate deep down in crevices and cliffs and places that haven't been kicked out by human invasion as they have been in big commercial caves in the East. In Mammoth Cave National Park alone, just in Mammoth Cave, there were once tens of millions of hibernating bats every winter. It's been quite well documented. And when these caves in the eastern U.S., there are just a few of these caves that, Mammoth Cave has 450 miles of map passages, has rooms that this room here would just rattle around as a small, you know, much smaller than Mammoth Cave. And these bats, if it got a little too cold one winter, they could move up the wall a little bit if they got hit with global climate change and got warm,
Yeah.
they could move down a little bit. It was perfect, and they evolved for tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of years to have this ability. But in the eastern U.S., going clear back to 1812 in the first, what was it, war with England that occurred in 1812?
The War of 1812.
Yeah. At any rate, they mined guano from all the eastern caves, and people got used to going in the caves, and then they commercialized them, and now almost all the best hibernation sites are taken over by people for commercial purposes, and the bats can't live there anymore. And so they've had to move into caves where the temperature is 8 or 9 degrees Celsius instead of 2 to 3. And we can look at the old caves where we know they were, and the temperatures are what they need. But now the temperatures are too high, so they burn fat faster, fungus grows faster, and we shouldn't be surprised that we've had mass die-off. But it's been very difficult for me to get scientists colleagues to admit what the problem is, because they're making so much money on big grants to find a cure that they don't really want to admit that they don't need a cure.
Thank you, Dr. Tuttle, for a fascinating discussion. My question is, what advice would you give to a young researcher who's considering dedicating a career to the study and conservation of a particular animal? What advice would you give them?
First of all, I recall last time I heard Alan speaking, he was very strong in saying, follow your passion. That is exactly what I've been saying for decades. You know, when I founded my first bat conservation organization, everybody thought I was stark raving crazy. Who would do that? And when I decided to study bats to begin with, everybody thought I was crazy. But if you're passionate about something, you're going to be better than anybody else probably, or very good at it. And there's usually a job for somebody that, you know, I don't do frivolous research on bats. I do research that shows why bats are absolutely essential and what we lose when we lose them. And people are aware that that's important knowledge, and so I have been supported. I had no trouble getting a job when I had my first job at the Milwaukee Public Museum. Whenever the county would be threatened with pay cuts, private companies would call me and say, Dr. Tuttle, I know you're hearing rumors that the museum may have to lay off staff. Don't worry, our company will pick up your salary if there are layoffs. And that was because I was passionate, and not just passionate, but sharing my passion for something that was important with people so that they could understand why it was important. Other scientists would lecture at the museum to the same crowds of people, and afterwards somebody would put their hand up, but why did you do that? Why was it important? At that time, I was studying frog-eating bats, and that was pretty esoteric. We don't know of anything frog-eating bats do that's particularly important for people. But nobody ever put their hand up and said, but why, Dr. Tuttle, why did you do that? I was so passionate in finding such interesting things that I'd become a great entertainer. And nobody asks why you entertain. So if you're passionate, don't let anybody get in your way. Go where your passion leads you. You're going to spend 70% of your life working. Work at something you enjoy.
Well said. I think that's outstanding advice.
Dr. Tuttle, thank you for your stories. What about this publish or perish attitude being an unfortunate reality of the way science is done today? And for a while really rang true to me, and I was wondering, what are some of the ways in which you've navigated your career around this reality?
I'm sorry, but my hearing is bad, and
He
with
was
you
asking-
having an accent, I can't hear exactly what you're
Let
saying.
me repeat the question for you.
Yeah.
So he's saying that in this day and age, it's publish or perish, and he wants to
Yeah.
know how you sort of circumvented that pressure that is put on most scientists of publish or perish.
I never got in the publish or perish rat race, and I did just fine. What I did was I always did research that was important and shared it well with people who understood. This publish or perish is a very bad thing. I know people right now who are doing bat studies who they want to milk them for extra papers that are unneeded and unnecessary, just wasting print and paper. We're rewarding scientists for the wrong things. It's my perhaps not too humble opinion that today we live in such an environmental, literally crisis. I mean, the next generation or two are going to have some very serious problems to face that we left them with. And it just doesn't make any sense to be awarding big grants, millions of dollars to do esoteric research that has no known potential benefit. There's so many things that we could be studying right now that would really make a difference in helping detoxify waste, do all kinds of things that we need to do. So I think, first of all, we need a system where research funding, let me start here. In my entire adult career, I never had a professional grant from the NSF or one of the main professional granting organizations of America. All of even my early research money came from private citizens. Back when I was studying frog-eating bats, they would fund my research because I would take them to the field as field assistants. They'd get a tax break for giving a donation to the museum and have fun out in the field studying bats with me. And I just made my research always something that was interesting, and people would get fascinated and want to support it, even when I wasn't doing research that was particularly important to people. So I more and more believe that we shouldn't be just handing out research for handing out money for basic research that doesn't have any known value.
We have another question back here.
First off, Dr. Tuttle, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I'm curious about more of a personal question. It seems throughout your years of research, you've been able to form these unique bonds with some of these bats. Is there one particular bat throughout your years that you formed a unique bond? And what was the name of that bat?
I hate to disappoint you, but I never name any of my pets or my research animals. But I have a story that will probably interest you more than if it was my personal one, but it's been vouched for by 2 PhD level bat biologists. There's a woman in Australia who, the big 4-foot, 5-foot wingspan bats will get electrocuted sometimes when they run into highline wires. And the pups that they're carrying don't get killed when the mother gets killed by the shock. And so they have what they call bat mums there that hand rear these orphan flying foxes. And this woman named June Took reared an orphan baby flying fox, and when it became an adult, she gradually released it to the wild again by just leaving its cage door open at night and leaving food that it could come back and eat, but it could also go out, and it finally went back and joined a camp of flying foxes in the wild. They all migrated for winter and were gone for several months, and the next spring one night this woman's in her backyard doing something, and here comes this 4-foot wingspan bat flying down, lands on her shoulder, and is just giving her all kinds of greeting sounds and licking her and happy to see her. And then it started coming back every night to see her, and she recognized soon enough that it was pregnant. Now, flying foxes take their pups and they take them away from the regular roost and put them somewhere else, because pythons will hang out at their regular roost and look for pups that might still be there when the mothers leave. So they'll leave the pups at a new location with maybe a couple of adult bats babysitting. This bat consistently brought its pup to the woman who had hand-reared her and let her babysit it while she went to feed at night, and would come and pick it up and take it back to the roost.
Wow.
There are stories like that that, that story was vouched for by 2 PhD level bat biologists. And I have had incredible experiences myself. We didn't get to show you the picture of a bat coming out of a pitcher plant. There are bats that have co-evolved with pitcher plants, and the plant that eats anything else that enters, be it insect or even a rat. Yeah, there's one of these little woolly bats. This bat lives in pitcher plants that eat anything else that enters. And the pitcher plant has developed a special ledge that the bat can sleep on, lowers the water level inside so it doesn't get the bat wet, and even has a reflective device that helps guide the bat's echolocation to find the plant when it comes home at night. And the plant gets rewarded by eating the bat's feces for breakfast.
A symbiotic relationship as it should be.
But this bat that you see photographed here, that picture is taken in my walk-in studio, because out where that bat lives in the swamps, I was going to show you a picture of the green pit viper snakes that hang from the vines, and if you look,
it's hard to see, yeah.
Yeah, off to my left mid picture, you see that green thing. That's a poisonous snake. Well, out where you find these bats, it rains unpredictably, pours down rain maybe twice in an hour. You're wading waist deep in water. You're trying to avoid these poisonous snakes. It's not a place to be staying up taking studio nice pictures. So I caught one of these bats, brought it in a pitcher plant and native plants to make a set in my studio. That's how I got the picture you just saw. But the first night I had it in captivity, I hand-fed it mealworms. My wife was there with me watching, but she didn't feed it. I fed it the mealworms. It undoubtedly never had a mealworm to eat before in its life, and certainly didn't have a giant feeding it to him. But the next morning when we came back to work and we entered the studio, that bat immediately flew to me and ignored my wife. Apparently remembered that I was the one that had fed it. And if you look on my website under our video gallery, you can see the video that my wife shot of that bat. It was flying up and it wanted me to feed it, and somehow it figured how it could get my attention by bumping me in the nose. And so I wouldn't even tell you this story if it wasn't recorded on a video that you can see for yourself. The bat just kept bumping me and bumping me and bumping me, and it was very hot climate, and I didn't have a shirt on, so my wife said, get your shirt on. She went and got a camera, and the bat's still bumping me in the nose after all this time. So she shows it bumping me in the nose, then I get a mealworm and hold it up, immediately goes and takes it out of my hand. I was flabbergasted. Early in my career, I would have said that small bats probably didn't have the intelligence to be, think up something like that, and I never even tried to train them. But now I have successfully trained bats that weigh no more than a penny, and they're just as smart as the big bats.
Well, Dr. Tuttle, I can't thank you enough for just an amazing evening and for real education on, I think, an animal that's been very misunderstood in our society. And this was just a fascinating talk. And we have up here your website, and I encourage everybody to visit it and help out, because I think we learned tonight how important bats are to our society and to our environment. So thank you very much.